Hey everyone, I'm Hoki Hoshi, and today let's talk about which mods you should be prioritizing when upgrading your cars. So we're going to be going through all the mod options on this stock BMW here and explaining the value of each upgrade. We'll start on the far right with conversions. Starting with engine swaps, I generally recommend keeping the stock engine if you can because they usually have the most efficient PI cost. However, if you're trying to push the car into a much higher class, or just prefer one of the engine swaps more, this is more of a personal preference choice and just depends on what you're trying to build the car for. As for the drivetrain, most rear-wheel and front-wheel drive cars will have an all-wheel drive swap option, but I generally recommend avoiding this as the car's weight distribution and suspension geometry was designed around the drivetrain that came on the car. So when you all-wheel drive swap, it can lead to some weird handling behavior and it usually costs you a lot of PI. However, there are definitely exceptions to this. Some cars will respond well to all-wheel drive swaps, and especially in online racing, as I'm sure most of you know, it can be worth it to swap for the extra launch speed and just a bit of an extra handling cushion. Now, as for the engine's aspiration, this is considered more of an engine mod, and naturally aspirated cars can definitely benefit from this, especially if you're trying to get a lot of extra power. Just consider that it does add weight, and if you can reach your power goals with the naturally aspirated engine, well, that's generally better. As for deciding between turbochargers and superchargers, well, it does come down a bit to personal preference and how much PI you can spend, but generally superchargers will gain power over the entire rev range at the sacrifice of a little bit more weight and lower peak power. However, turbochargers generally weigh less, can reach a higher peak power, but don't reach that peak power until higher in the rev range. Turbochargers are generally considered better even though they don't add power lower in the rev range because you're often only in the higher rev range where the turbo is spooled up during racing. Now let's move on to Aero, which can be a great tweaking tool on some cars. Some Aero adds weight while some can reduce weight, so if you're just over a class restriction and can sacrifice a few pounds, throwing on a heavier front bumper might get you where you need. But if you have a PI point or two to spare and could use some weight reduction, throwing on a lightweight hood could get you to the top of that class while saving a little bit of weight. Now, sadly, a lot of cars don't have a lot of options to play with in Aero, but most will have the infamous two, the Forza front splitter and the Forza rear wing. Adding either of these upgrades can be extremely valuable on higher class cars as the extra downforce adds a ton of extra grip. However, on cars roughly B class or below, these upgrades usually aren't worth it because the cars aren't traveling fast enough to get enough of a benefit from that downforce. Try driving your cars without downforce mods first, as the upgrades can cost a lot of PI, but if you struggle with grip at high speeds, add either the front splitter if you need more front grip, or the rear wing if you need more rear grip. Now let's talk tire compounds. It's a common misconception that race tires are always better than sport, which are always better than street, and so on. However, if you can't heat up your tires to proper race temperatures, they're not worth it. A-Class is the rough cutoff for using race tires, and rally tires can actually be a great middle ground tire compound even if you're not rally racing. But if you want to know more which compound you should be using, warm up your tires for a few minutes by driving around, and then open up your tire telemetry. If the tires are staying in the blue range too often, you need to downgrade your compound. And if they're staying in the yellow range too often, you need to upgrade your compound. Once you've figured out your tire compound, it's time to move on to tire widths. Upgrade your drive tires as much as you can in most cases. So rear wheel drive should have max rear tire width and vice versa for front wheel drive. The opposite tire should generally only be upgraded if you have grip issues. Rear-wheel drive cars often don't need max upgraded front tires, but will often benefit from 10 or 20 extra millimeters of tire width. Now, if your car is all-wheel drive, you can almost always get away with not max upgrading either front or rear tire width, but if you need to upgrade anything, prioritize rear first. For rim selection, of course this is a lot down to personal preference, but I'm sure you've noticed different wheels have different weights. This can be another great tweaking tool, and it also brings us to our first big question of, do different types of weight reduction matter? In the real world, weight reduction mods like lighter rims, lightweight drive shafts, or lightweight flywheels have a lot more of an effect than just raw weight reduction like carbon fiber body panels. Reduced wheel weight, which leads to lighter rotational mass, has all kinds of handling benefits, but I have yet to see conclusive evidence as to whether or not this is reflected accurately in Forza. With that said, I still like to prioritize reduction in wheel weight, drive shaft weight, and flywheel weight over just raw weight reduction. Moving forward to the size of your rims, bigger wheels means more weight, but also more responsive handling and potentially better grip. Try to keep your wheels around 17 inches plus in most cases, but don't worry too much about this unless you notice responsiveness issues or grip issues. I don't have the option here on this BMW, but you might notice you have wheel spacing options as well. This is usually an easy upgrade pick because it only costs 1 or 2 PI and can make noticeable handling improvements as well as improving the look of your car. Now let's move on to transmission mods, starting with the clutch. Although you lose a little bit of weight with upgrades here, focus more on your shift time. If you're not gaining any shift time or only 100th or 200ths of a second, then this is generally not worth it. But this is where it can be helpful to drive the car and feel how fast the car shifts. It's a less effective mod if you're driving with a clutch, but this mod can be hugely helpful with slow shift times on manual clutchless and automatic driving modes. As for the transmission itself, generally you only want to upgrade this if the stock gear ratios are bad or if you still need faster shift times and the clutch has been max upgraded. When adding a lot of power over the stock build, you'll usually throw off your gear ratios and it can be helpful to upgrade enough to unlock final drive, but if the ratios are still off with final drive tuning or shifting is still too slow and you've again maxed out your clutch, then go for the max upgrade. Now your drive shaft is another upgrade that's debatably better than raw weight reduction, but it's mostly used as a good tweaking tool to squeeze a little bit of extra weight reduction out of the car. I usually upgrade this on all of my builds as it does add some good weight reduction. The differential upgrade option is often a pretty easy pick as it usually doesn't cost any PI and just unlocks the differential tuning option for you. Now let's move on to braking, and this is another upgrade similar to tire compounds where the max upgrade isn't always better. Only upgrade if you're not maxing out grip with your tires during braking. Otherwise, your PI is better spent elsewhere as extra braking strength from that upgrade just isn't being used. Most cars below A-Class will not benefit from the max braking upgrade. As for suspension, you generally want to skip over the street and sport options and just go straight into the max upgrade for whatever type of racing you plan on doing. So race, drift, and rally suspension options are really the only ones I ever use. There are some theories floating around that drift suspension might be better for racing and racing suspension could be better for rally, but these are generally false. You essentially never use the extra steering angle gained from drifting suspension while you're racing, and if you have problems with turning in or cornering, it's usually not an issue with your steering angle. As for race suspension being better for rally, this is often just a tuning issue, as the stock tuning values for rally suspension are often way too soft, giving the impression that a stiffer race suspension is better, even though when properly tuned, rally suspension is far superior. For your anti-roll bars, this is usually an easy max upgrade for me. Tuning your sway bars can have a huge effect on the handling of the car, and it usually only costs a small amount of PI for both the front and rear sway bars. Now for chassis reinforcement, pay attention to your PI here. Most modern cars don't need much or any reinforcement, and you can just be adding weight without really adding any benefit. This upgrade can be extremely useful on older cars that are being pushed into a higher class and struggle with some sloppy handling. But again, most modern cars won't benefit much from this. Now before we get into engine mods, it's finally time to talk about raw weight reduction. This is often a great pick if you can afford it. Adding power might make you faster on the straights, but subtracting weight makes you faster everywhere. I still recommend picking reduced wheel weight, drive shaft weight, and flywheel weight over the raw weight reduction here, but if it's a choice between power and weight reduction, it's generally agreed that you should shave the weight. Finally, let's talk about adding some power. We'll go over each of these mods like we have been, and then we'll talk about overall prioritizing goals when upgrading your car. Upgrading your intake can add a little bit of power and torque and sometimes reduces weight, but is generally seen as a more lower priority mod. Your intake manifold and throttle body will add a lot of power and torque and usually shave a little bit of weight and can be a good way to add some power. The fuel system is another somewhat lower priority mod, as it does add good power and torque, but doesn't shave any weight. Ignition upgrades are similar and should be lower on your priority list as well. Exhaust is a great mod that should always be prioritized higher, as it shaves a lot of weight, adds good power and good torque, and as an added bonus, it makes your car's engine sound louder. Upgrading your camshaft is a phenomenal mod and should almost always be prioritized first, as not only does it add a good bit of power and torque, it also increases your red line, meaning that you'll be in higher power ranges more often. Upgrading your valves should take similar priority to your intake, as they both add a little bit of power and torque and usually reduce a little bit of weight. Upgrading your displacement can be a great way to get a lot of extra power and torque throughout your entire power band. This is a great selection if you're looking to add a good bit of power. Just keep in mind you usually won't be reducing weight. As for compression, this is another mod that takes the same priority as your valves and intake, adding a little bit of power and taking away a little weight. Now if you have a turbo or supercharger, you'll have the option to upgrade that as well, and it can be a great way to get a ton of extra power out of your car. Now your next options will usually be cooling. If you have a turbo or supercharger, you'll have the option to add an intercooler, and if you don't, you'll just have the oil cooling option. In almost all cases, you should try to avoid these if you can get power elsewhere, as both of these options will add a good bit of weight and don't usually add that much power. Both of these options are more meant for players that use simulation damage and don't want their engines to overheat, but most Horizon players don't use simulation damage, and thus this upgrade is usually wasted PI. Your final upgrade option is almost always the flywheel, and this is the final option where it's debatable as to whether or not this weight reduction matters more than raw weight reduction. I usually try to prioritize this, but it can be a great tweaking tool for adding or removing 1 or 2 performance index points. Now that should cover just about every mod you'll encounter on most cars, so let's talk about what you should be prioritizing as a whole. You want to start first with things like anti-roll bars, differential upgrades, and wheel spacing options, as these rarely cost more than 1 or 2 PI and can make really noticeable handling improvements, especially if tuned properly. Next, decide on race, rally, or drift suspension for what type of driving you're going to be doing, and then get your tires and your braking in order. Remember that the max upgrade is not always the best choice. Next in priority should be making sure you can shift quick enough with clutch and transmission upgrades, and making sure that your transmission is upgraded enough to keep good gear ratios. And then finally, with what PI you have left, you should focus on weight reduction and power. Remember that when adding power, you should focus on upgrades like the camshaft and the exhaust, and when reducing weight, you should focus on wheel weight, driveshaft weight, and flywheel weight over the raw weight reduction. When deciding between weight reduction and adding power, keep a calculator handy to do power to weight ratios. This can be done pretty simply by taking your power and dividing it by your weight to get your power to weight ratio. Then make an adjustment and take your new power, divide it by your new weight, and if the number is lower, you have a worse power to weight ratio. If the number is higher, you've done a good job and you have a better power to weight ratio. And that should be just about everything you need to know to get a good start on how to upgrade your cars. As always, if you guys have any other helpful tips or insights, or you want to ask a question, hop down into the comments. I've learned a lot of new stuff from the comment section on my videos, and even though I can't answer every question, a lot of you guys have done a great job of that as well. So thank you for that, and thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.